Thanks to everyone for joining us today as we sit down to talk about trends. And these trends, as Cole mentioned, are from our recently published survey on digital trends in e-health and in digital health and healthcare. This is something we've done on more or less an annual basis over the years. We published our last one right at the end of 2016, decided to shift the time of year a little bit. So it's been a little more than a year since we did that last one. But some great information in this. Hopefully you'll find it valuable. Again, you can get that survey going to geonetric.com/2018-survey. And there's, as Cole mentioned, all the things that we're talking about here today. There's actually quite a lot more detail in the written report. We get into some areas that we're not going to have time to delve into today, but lots of good insights there, and hopefully lots of good insights for you here today as well. So a little bit of background on the survey itself. This was as you might expect, a survey that we collected data online. We solicited a number of people who work within the digital realm in hospitals and health systems, mostly by email, but we also had some calling campaigns reaching out to many organizations, social media outreach, and we did that from Geonetric as well as through our partner in this project, eHealthcare Strategy and Trends. And this is the second year that we've partnered up with them. It's been a great partnership. I feel like we are able to get information from more organizations through that relationship. And just as importantly, they help us get the learnings back out to a larger group. And so there's an article upcoming in an upcoming issue of eHealthcare Strategy and Trends. And they've been a great partner throughout this. Couple things that are maybe good background on how we are taking the data and translating it into insights here. So certainly we go through and we analyze all the individual questions and what are they telling us. But what we find is often just looking at the overall average might be nice for benchmarking, but it doesn't really give you a full picture of what's going on, and maybe more importantly, it doesn't tell you what you need to do in order to get better. And so we break this out in a couple of different ways. One way that you'll see throughout our presentation today is we break things out into leaders and laggards, and well, leaders, average, and laggards. So we really look at how leading organizations ahead of the curve, are doing things differently, are executing differently than the organizations that are just keeping up, and the organizations, frankly, that in their own ratings of themselves are falling behind. And we'll talk a little bit more about exactly how those ratings come together here in a moment, but we do break a lot of things out that way, really with the eye to how are leaders doing things differently. We also, as we do this, get not only information from provider organizations, although we do get lots of that information, we also get some information from the agencies and vendors that they partner with in order to execute on these initiatives. And while the provider organizations have the deepest knowledge within their own organization, the vendor perspective can sometimes bring some interesting insights as well, given that they're often working with many healthcare organizations. You can sometimes see patterns and can compare and contrast with a little different perspective. And so oftentimes we'll compare how vendors feel about an issue versus how provider organizations feel about an issue. And again, another source of genuine insights and not just data. We did work with an outside firm to do a lot of the number crunching and coding. It's not just something that we did ourselves, although we do end up doing a lot of that and all the analysis on that here at Geonetric. And the way that we're going to talk through things today is really in what I call an insight-centered presentation. We sat back and said, what were the big aha moments as we were going through and analyzing this data? And then what's the data that sort of led us to those conclusions? And that's how we're going to walk through things today. In terms of the mix of organizations represented, we try to get a good cross-section of the provider healthcare continuum within the United States. That said, almost half of respondents were multi-hospital health systems. And I will say that the organizations have been getting progressively larger on average. And I think, as is no surprise to anyone, that's really a side effect of the merger and acquisition activity, as well as a lot of organic growth that's been happening. Organizations have been really working very hard to accomplish as well. So while I think the pool of individual organizations out there within the healthcare provider space is smaller. Those individual organizations have gotten quite a bit larger, and some of the numbers that we'll see today are reflective of that. But almost half is multi-hospital health systems, another 16% single health systems, and you see how the rest of this breaks out here as well. We did have data from 246 providers as well as 47 vendors, so lots and lots of data to work with. So with all that background out of the way, let's start to look at our insights here. And the first one is that content is hard, but ultimately content is worth it, right? And there were a lot of indications that content was a really key element of the success of every organization that feels like they're doing things well, and is something that when you're not doing it well, it really seems to hold you back. And frankly, it's not easy to do well. There's a lot of resources put there today, and there are more resources that organizations are planning to put there in the future. One illustration of that is actually in the questions that we asked in order to come up with that distribution of leaders, average, and laggard organizations. This is the set of questions, and actually I encourage you, when you download the report, go through and rate yourself. And you can score yourself out and kind of decide where you fall in this overall continuum. We did this a little differently than we did in years past. We actually added a little more granularity to this. We used to just ask, are you ahead or behind? This year we said, compared to your competition, are you significantly outperforming, slightly underperforming, or significantly underperforming your competition? And then we scored those out, 2 points for significantly outperforming, 1 for slightly, and then -1 and -2 for the 2 categories on the other side of the scale. So you can go through, you can do this yourself, and actually find out where you fall in that distribution. I guess I should show you the distribution. This is sort of how things came out when we did that scoring. As you saw on the previous slide, here I'm hopping back and forth. As you see in this slide, we feel pretty good about the things we're doing across the board, right? Everyone's a little bit above average kind of thing. And so we actually centered the distribution around 1 point rather than 0 point, just to reflect that a little bit. It's what felt right as we were going through looking at responses and looking at the organizations and the websites behind those to some extent. And then we picked a range. So the cutoff between average and laggard was -3. The cutoff between average and leader was +5. And then from there, we just looked at how the distributions broke out. So we've got fewer laggards, to be fair, about half as many laggards as we had leaders, and about half of the overall distribution falls into the average category, which made a lot of sense to us. So that's the distribution and sort of how the scoring came out. Let me actually go back again to the overall scoring. As you look at the overall scoring, although there's a little bit of grade inflation, something we're all a little bit above average kind of thing across the board, but you do see that for most of the categories, it's fairly balanced, and everything falls within a fairly tight range there. And there are really 2 exceptions to that rule. And one is social media and community management, where organizations just felt like they were killing it. It was far and away the thing that organizations felt most good about. And in many cases, organizations that are in the laggard part of thing, if there was anything they felt good about, this was that thing. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have email marketing and marketing automation, where the vast majority of organizations really feel like they're struggling here. And it was noticeably different in terms of that distribution, where organizations just felt like they had a long way to go in order to be competitive with what they were doing in that space. Now we contrast this, and this is the overall, this is all 247 respondents to the survey, and we compare that then to just what the leaders have to say. And again, this is the set of questions on which we put people into the different groups. So it should be no surprise to anyone that the leaders feel awfully good about how they're doing. It's sort of definitionally true. However, the deviations from that pattern, I think, are really the interesting insight as we look at how leaders perform versus the group overall. And the laggards and the average were pretty similar to this as well. And that is to say that the leaders, when they felt like they really excelled, the things they excelled at above all other things was content. And this wasn't the only indication, but it was one of the very clear indications that content is sort of that core workout for your website, right? When it's good, when it's solid, everything else you're doing is easier, everything else you're doing is more effective, right? It is, when it's done well, the tide that raises all boats. Everything else you're doing gets more effective because your content is solid, you're generating lots of it, and you're doing the things you need to do to make sure that the content itself is effective. Likewise, we see indications that when the content engine that you have for the organization, because this is not a point in time snapshot, this really is your ability to put the stuff out on an ongoing basis. When that content engine is not good, is not strong, it really does drag down all of your other efforts, makes everything that you do harder. So content's tough, and we'll see more indications throughout just how much energy organizations are putting into content. But when it's done well, it is very much worth it. All right, our second aha, and maybe not a surprise to anyone, but we do this digital marketing stuff to get patients in the door. Hospitals want patients. What is less clear is if we can demonstrate that all these efforts that we're putting towards getting patients are actually bringing them in the numbers that we want and expect. So we asked a couple of different questions related to goals for digital marketing. And so this is looking at all of the digital marketing efforts. And the number one item by a pretty wide margin was new patient recruitment. And then below that, we had things like consumer engagement and awareness and delivering a positive ROI to the organization. Now, as we looked at this, there wasn't a lot of deviation between the leaders, average, and laggards. The biggest one that jumped out, though, is that amongst the laggards, that delivering positive ROI was far, far down the list. I think it was second from the bottom. And as we dig into it and we look at other indications about what's going on here, it doesn't seem like the idea of ROI is not interesting or important to that group. It's really more a question of they don't have the tools. They don't have a sufficiently developed MarTech tech stack to actually be able to answer those questions. It is outside their reach. And so rather than having, considering that to be a top goal and not really being able to address that question at all, they are mostly using things like new patient recruitment as a proxy for ROI. If we're bringing patients in the door, then we feel like there's a good chance that the ROI is positive. And frankly, at least bringing new patients in the door is a metric that much of the leadership can react to positively, but they just don't have the tools in place to deal with that. And they're not the only one. So this is that same list. The bars here are the same bars that we saw a moment ago. They're just flipped on their side because Excel doesn't let us do the squiggly line overlay when we're going up and down. But that line behind the bars is the ability to demonstrate these things. So we have our goals and then our ability to demonstrate. And there's some things that are aligned fairly well, right? So again, consumer engagement and awareness, it feels like we're able to communicate that, we're able to measure that. There are areas that we're further down the list of priorities, but we're pretty good at measuring those too. Employee recruitment, community relations, fundraising even. Those are things that in many cases the transactions are happening entirely digitally, or at least the first stage, significant stage of them are happening digitally. And so it's relatively easy to go and pull the metrics out of that to see if these things are working or not working. So doing a pretty good job of measuring in some of those areas. But we do have some gaps, some pretty important goals where we're just not able to measure things in the way that we really should be able to and want to be able to going forward. Patient recruitment, that's a challenge. Much of that happens offline today. Positive ROI, and frankly, some of the constituents of that, like increased revenue. Real challenges to be able to capture that today. And I think a good call to arms for us as we go forward to make sure that we're able to capture that information so that we can communicate the value we're delivering to the organization effectively. There were a couple of new emerging challenges that popped up here as well. And certainly we've always asked about barriers, we've always asked about challenges, and there were some things that were very consistent. A lot going on in this chart. It's a bit of a messy chart. It's probably my favorite chart in the whole book though, so take that for what you will. There's a couple different things that we're trying to represent here. This is a sort of a what's your biggest issue, what's your least important issue kind of question. We asked across all of these different areas, and we're showing here both the provider answers to that, and those are the lighter colored thinner bars that are sitting on top, as well as the vendor answers, and those are the darker colored bars that are behind them. Everything to the right of 0 means it's a significant issue. Everything to the left are things that they reported as not being significant issues. So we can look both at what was reported and also the differences in opinion between providers and vendors here. And really, there's a lot of alignment. We've always had a lot of votes in terms of resource issues being a problem or a barrier. So lack of time, lack of budget, those we'd really expect. That's the stuff we'd expect to see, and we're certainly seeing it here with a fair degree of agreement. This year, we saw a very high degree of agreement that the challenges in measuring effectiveness and ROI is also a top item. It was by far and away the number one from the vendor perspective. It was really within that cluster of 3 or 4 at the top of the list for providers as well. There are also some areas where there were some differences of opinion, right? And you know, certainly the lack of internal buy-in, you know, the providers don't really see that as being a big issue. However, the vendors are not so sure. There are not a lot of people feeling like that is a big barrier. However, it was one that they weren't so convinced was not a barrier either. Likewise, skill and training gaps. That was something that the laggards in the group from the provider side did indicate was a problem, but everyone else felt like not a big issue. Again, the vendors are of mixed feeling on that, but not so convinced that that's not an issue for at least some of their clients out there. The one that jumped out at us, though, was the item at the bottom of the list here. And this was, from a vendor perspective, the thing they had the least concern about, which is the ability to support online transactions with offline operations. And this is, you know, the sort of thing where when you're doing online scheduling, for instance, it's relatively straightforward from a digital perspective to put up some kind of solution to allow people to request appointments or make appointments in real time. However, particularly when your organization is a little more complicated, has a lot of moving parts, maybe a lot of clinics, maybe geographically distributed, doesn't have a centralized scheduling operation, actually operationalizing a online interaction point, having the schedulers involved doing what they need to do, all those sorts of things can be a barrier that might be impossible to overcome. So those operational realities sometimes make the execution of some of these transactions much more difficult, and really are preventing the things that you want from happening on a digital side. And so we saw this dichotomy where the vendors were not very concerned with this, probably because it's not something they're tackling themselves, something that I think much more often folks within the healthcare enterprise are actually having to deal with. But for provider organizations, and particularly the provider organizations in that leader group, this was a very significant item. I think for the leaders, it was number one on their list. And so for the folks that are pushing the boundaries, for folks that are trying to do more interaction online, more transactional capability within their web operations, they're hitting this wall quite a lot now. And so there's a real need for folks within marketing, which is typically not been that involved with the operational folks within the organization, to actually build some bridges so that when you're trying to push initiatives forward that require operational things to happen, that you have a relationship there and a basis to start getting those changes to occur. The other big sort of emerging trend that we saw came exclusively from the vendor side. This was a question that we only asked the vendors, but we asked them where are the areas where healthcare is falling behind other industries. And certainly, again, you can see we can get a range of responses with a decent number in the digital design and user experience area, a decent number in social media, things like that. But overwhelmingly, the answer we got was overall digital strategy. And again, I'm not sure this should be a big surprise when we look at industries like retail, like travel, like financial services. They've gone through, as an industry and as individual organizations, this massive transformation fueled by digital capabilities. And it's changed the way they deliver the services. It changes the way they provide customer service. It has been transformational for those industries, and we just have not seen anything like that in healthcare thus far. And so, yes, I think there is a big gap in digital strategy. I think we're behind many other industries when it comes to digital strategy overall. And so it continues to be an area that we want to focus on as we go forward. All right. We asked a lot of stuff about teams and team structures and things like that. And there were a couple clear winners in terms of what we've been referring to as the hot jobs in healthcare, right? The areas where organizations are hiring the most or looking to expand what they're doing most aggressively. And those are in the areas of content, CRM, social media, and marketing automation. But before we get into the details of that specifically, let's talk a little bit about teams a little bit more generally. So we look at overall team size, and these are the overall averages for team size within the different groups. And so there are some differences in organization size. Leaders tend to be a little bit larger organizations, and so that's part of what's fueling the larger teams there. But on average, they just have very much larger teams and much larger budgets. So those leaders have almost 13 people on average. The average team, the average cohort has 6.5 FTEs, and the laggards are a little below 4 FTEs for their organization. And this is how we've always reported this data in the past. And one of the things that really led to a lot of discussions for us in terms of how is this data most actionable, we got to this question of the distribution, and ultimately, I think we're sort of in the process here of transitioning to looking at medians rather than overall averages. So this is the distribution of those team sizes, and you can see the scale at the bottom. There's a lot of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s. And then, as you get to the right side of that scale, we're getting, 10 to 15, 16 to 20, more than 50, getting to very large organizations. And so those very large organizations, or the organizations with very large teams, I should say, really throw that average off. To a large degree. They're major factors. You have one group that has 100 people on their web team, you need a lot of onesie twosies in order to sort of bring that back into balance. And so the average, while it's accurate information, is not necessarily the most actionable information. So we wanted to move more to looking at this in terms of medians. And so the line there's the 50% point. My line seems to have drifted, so it's more or less the 50% point. But you start to see the difference between what we were talking about a moment ago for averages and the medians here. For laggards, the laggards were 3.79. The reality is, for the laggards, half of the teams have only 2 FTEs or less, right? So the teams are almost half as big from a median perspective as what we saw from an average perspective. Even the leaders, where we had nearly 13 people on the team, that median number is only 4. And so while yes, the average is 13, when we really look at the distribution of organizations and the distribution of staff sizes, those median staff sizes are actually quite a bit smaller than that. We also looked at what the distribution of roles look like within those teams. And so overall, we saw the most staffing going to content, to copywriting and content development, followed very closely behind by general web administration, and then strategy. And those were the only 3 where we had, on average, 1 FTE or more allocated to those. There's a couple that are close: team or project management, social media. But it gives you a sense here of the places where the largest staffing is being applied. The areas that have really the least staffing at this point are email and marketing automation, user experience and usability, and SEO. So it gives you a feel for just how organizations are allocating the team resources that they have. In addition to that, we looked at the areas where organizations were outsourcing more. So, and again, we show the distribution here because sometimes those distributions are more insightful than just getting an average. The darkest bars on the left side there, that they're basically saying we outsource all of the effort for this item. And then the stuff on the right side is basically stuff we do entirely in-house. We outsource none of it. And they don't all add up to quite 100 because there's some I don't knows in there as well. But we decided not to normalize it out and just see what the real numbers were that people were putting out there. We ordered this, if you're wondering what the ordering here is, we kind of looked at outsourced, and I'm air quoting here, as being any time that they indicated all or most. And so we added those 2 things together, and that's the sort order you're seeing at play here. So there's some areas where there's quite a lot of outsourcing going on, right? Digital advertising, web development, web design, even to some extent video production. We also have some areas where there's really very, very little outsourcing being done. Project management, social media, and then there's a bunch of stuff in the middle of that pack as well, like strategy, general web administration, CRM, things of that nature. And those are really things where there's a lot of collaborative usage there, where they're doing some of it in-house and some of it out of house as well. So at the end of the day, we have a lot of different data around each of these different functional areas. And for a couple of these areas, I wanted to pull that data all together and show it to you as a package. We picked the 4 where we were expecting to see the most growth in new staffing in the coming year. And for that, we looked at organizations saying that they were going to add staff, less organizations saying they were going to reduce staff in that area. So the first of those is content writing, copywriting, and content development. It's the area that has the largest number of largest staffing allocated today, 1.27 on average. 16% are looking to add staff in the coming year. And it's an area that's sort of modestly, like midway in terms of the amount of insourcing and outsourcing. So 62% are putting it in-house, 8% are mostly outsourcing that function. Analytics or CRM administration, really when we dug into this a little more, and I think next time we do this, we would split those 2 categories out, but it seems to mostly be the CRM side of this that's getting a lot of attention. It's an area that didn't have particularly high staffing levels today, but 14% are looking to add staff. It is a pretty heavily outsourced task, a lot of mixed collaborative kind of uses, as well as a fair amount of outsourcing with 23%. Analytics CRM is also the area where vendors felt there was the largest amount of insufficient investment. That's actually the bottom categories. We're asking vendors, are your clients over-investing in this area, adequately investing in this area, or insufficiently investing in this area? And it was the area that had the largest number of vendors indicating there was not sufficient investment in CRM administration. Social media and community management, again, fairly highly staffed area today. Also the area that organizations felt most strongly about when we went back to those original questions that we used to break out the different peer groups. 11% are looking to add staff there. It's something that's almost exclusively done in-house. 80% are basically doing it entirely in-house today. And it was also the area that the vendors, I think, felt was most adequately invested. Not a lot of overinvestment, but it was adequately invested in by most organizations. And the last one was email marketing or marketing automation, which on that leader laggard curve was the one that got the worst rating. So they're putting a lot of staff into the area with the best, where they feel best about what they're doing, and they're putting a lot of staffing into the area where they feel most behind in general. It's not an area that has huge staffing levels today, but again, about 11% looking to add staffing, and it is one that gets a mix of insourcing and outsourcing as well. All right, our next aha here is looking at marketing investment here and digital investment here. And for the second year in a row, we're seeing very clear indications that the marketing mix is shifting, dollars are shifting from traditional marketing channels to digital. But let's start by just talking about budgets in general. So we'll start off again with the numbers the way we've always reported them, which is to say the average overall investment. That has leading organizations, when you include staffing and direct investment, spending 1.4 million on average. Laggards spending more like 800,000 on average. But again, here we looked at it and said, okay, like what do the medians look like compared to that? And it does paint a fairly different picture here. So amongst the leaders, we've got that median, including staff, being more like $475,000. and laggards down around $200,000, including direct investment and staff again. So it's a very different set of numbers. Each of those numbers tells you some different things, but it gives you a better feel for what's going on in terms of a staffing or in terms of an investment level across the board. We also break this out per bed, and I'll just go ahead and bring the other set of numbers in here. And again, the numbers look a little bit different because of different organization sizes and things like that. Interestingly, while the overall investment had sort of a clear trend one direction, because of organization sizes, we're actually seeing some of this trend from a median perspective, at least going the other direction. So we look at that median investment, including staff, on a per bed basis. Leaders are actually spending the least. They're spending $1,000 per bed. Laggards are spending $1,500 per bed on average. So it gives us a good idea. And again, there's some size and scale things that I think make leaders more efficient in some of their investments relative to their size. But I think there's also some other things driving some of those laggard costs up, again, relative to the size of their organization. There's maybe some inefficient ways that they're going about doing the things they're trying to do. So we looked both at overall marketing budget and the digital marketing budget, and looked at how those things intersected as well. But at a high level, 54% of overall marketing budgets were staying the same, about a quarter are increasing, and about 16% are decreasing. So, but more than half roughly staying the same. We look at digital marketing budgets in contrast, and almost 60% are growing, a third are remaining the same. Very, very few budgets are decreasing, and when we dig into it, it's groups that are like mid-redesign for the most part, very, very large teams. So it seems like they've staffed up or brought resources from elsewhere in the organization in order to do a big push on something, and their expectations probably at the end of that process, when those things go live, they're not going to continue to keep all of those resources dedicated to digital marketing. So it's a small slice of the market, and it really is almost exclusively with a particular set of situations behind them. But even just looking at things at this level, if digital marketing budgets are increasing and overall marketing budgets are not, we know that there's some dollars shifting into digital from other things, or sometimes at the expense of other things. And so when we break this down, the columns here are that overall marketing budget, the rows are the digital marketing budget, and what we see is even when the overall marketing budget remains the same, 54% of digital marketing budgets are increasing. When overall marketing budgets are decreasing, still 43% of the digital marketing budgets are increasing. And likewise, even when those overall marketing budgets are decreasing, more than a quarter are staying the same. So we have a lot of different situations at play here, but it's pretty clear that there's evidence of dollars shifting from traditional media to digital media. And this is somewhat different than what we saw a few years ago. For a long, long time, what we saw was the overall marketing budget was the overall marketing budget, and we'd only do digital when, we could hold the overall marketing budget steady and get new additional dollars for digital. And now we're seeing that even if we can't hold on to our overall dollars, we're putting more into digital, and for reasons like its measurability and its effectiveness. More evidence along those lines, what percent of your overall marketing budget is dedicated to digital, and we put in both this year's numbers and the last survey we did, which again was released right at the end of 2016. And you can see that across the board, we have a couple percentage point increase in the portion of the overall marketing budget going to digital. For leaders, that's almost fully a third. For laggards, it's 23%. But in all cases, it's gone up 3, 4, 5 percentage points in that 16 months between the two surveys. We ask a number of questions about redesigns as well. And for a few years there, we saw the redesign cycle slowing down. Back in the day, we would pretty consistently see most organizations have more or less a 3-year cycle. A third of organizations were in the planning stages, a third of organizations were in the process of doing a redesign, a third of organizations had done a redesign in the last year. So they were in more or less a 3-year cycle for these things. We saw that slow down. We saw that slow down to a 4 or even 5-year cycle. And now we're seeing evidence that that cycle might be picking up. So this is how we ask the question. So I know I have no plans to redesign in the future. Yes, I'm in the planning stages. Yes, we're actually in the process of doing a redesign right now, or we've recently completed a redesign, recently being within the last 12 months. And so you look at that recently completed, it's 18%. So, it's about a 5-year cycle. The redesign in progress, 20%, about a 5-year cycle. But then we look at planning stages, and that's 30%, much, much bigger portion. Which tends to indicate to us that some of the stuff is starting to move forward more rapidly, that there's indications that the cycle is picking up here again after having stretched out a little bit, sort of post move into responsive design that we saw several years ago. Now, when we ask why organizations are doing that redesign, the number one vote getter by a wide margin was improving the overall user experience. And certainly, I think anyone, no matter what the reason for why they moved down this path in the first place, believe that improving the overall user experience is the primary goal for the redesign. But there's some other things sort of below that I think give some interesting insight into what's going on in the marketplace right now. The number two item at 11% was improving the mobile and responsive experience. And so for a while there, that was the driver of redesigns. People were moving to responsive, even if there were other things they wanted to accomplish. This was the thing that let them build the business case that it was time to move forward, no matter where they were within their normal redesign cycle. And so what we're seeing here now is there's still a handful of organizations that are going responsive for the first time. That is baked into that 11%. But in addition to that, particularly for the organizations that were earlier movers, they've now got a couple years on those responsive experiences. Expectations from consumers have come a long way in the last 3, 4, 5 years when it comes to interacting with these things on mobile devices. The way we do it, frankly, the devices are getting a lot better, and there's more that we can do with them. And so it's, for those who were earlier movers in that space, it really is time to go and do sort of their 2.0 version of a responsive designed website. The other item that was big this year that's not really something that's been a significant factor, not a very significant factor in the past, is changes in branding. And so I think part of what we believe we're seeing here is these mergers of organizations, in some cases the organic growth, where the name no longer represents the organization in many cases. Particularly, a lot of healthcare systems have sort of geographic qualifiers as part of their name. And once you expand, once you buy another system that doesn't fit into that box, suddenly the name doesn't work very well anymore. That's part of it. Sometimes when you merge systems together, it's just time to initiate a new brand for any one of a number of reasons. And we're seeing a lot of that going on in the market. And I think we're seeing some of that driving a new web experience as well. When you fundamentally change the way you tell your story as a system, you need to change the way you're telling that story in an online perspective as well. There were a few areas where we dug into some things from a feature function perspective, and I think the most interesting of those was personalization. I go to way too many conferences, probably more than the average person within a hospital doing these things. And so, I get to see some very clear trends in the kinds of sessions that are popping up and kind of what information's in those sessions. And there have been just a ton of sessions around online personalization in the last couple of years. And to be fair, most of those have been pretty thin in terms of actual real world examples of organizations doing meaningful personalization work. They're all sort of at the very starting point. Organizations are struggling to find good examples, which tells me that while there's a lot of excitement about this, it's not necessarily something that has really hit the mainstream just yet. But there's a lot of excitement, a lot of organizations wanting to get into this space. And so we asked some questions, and we've been doing other research as well recently to understand how this is working for organizations, what they're doing, things of that nature. So I will say it was a pretty small portion of the overall audience that we were talking to that is really using personalization at this stage. But amongst that audience, these were the types of personalizations, the methods of personalizations that they indicated that they're using. So we had a few more people using things like campaigns and demographics. A lot of the information, though, a lot of the personalization that people indicated really came down to things that I think in a lot of cases we think of as responsive design. So changing the experience based on device or browser, things like that. and so, some of that is what's going on here as well. There's also decent usage of things like search terms or location demographics, things like that. And I should point out, we had a decent number of folks who said, yes, we're using personalization. I don't really know what we're doing. And that plays a role a little bit here as well. Because one of the things we wanted to look at was how many personalization methods are being used by an organization. And you get a big spike at 1, and that spike is a little bit exaggerated because we had a number of folks who said, well, I don't actually know what personalization methods we're using. So that was their 1. And so the 1 is a little bit exaggerated, but you do see that there's not a lot of organizations that are using a wide range of personalization methods. So this is percentages of that small group who actually indicated they're doing personalization today. Very few of them are using more than 2 or 3 personalization approaches as part of that strategy today. So still dabbling, still getting their toes wet in terms of those tools and those approaches. The real number that jumped out here at us was that we asked about, is this actually making your digital marketing better, right? And so we asked the question, we wanted to include the actual text on this one. Our organization can demonstrate that website personalization has improved the performance of our digital marketing, right? And this is something where, most of those off-the-shelf tools for personalization have very strong metric engines behind them, allow you to do A/B segmentation kinds of things. You can see when you have personalization, when you don't, how do behaviors change, things of that nature. And even with that set of tools, we see more than a third saying, really disagreeing with that statement. A full third saying they don't know if this is impacting what they're doing from a marketing perspective at all. They can't see the data that's telling them that it's better, but they're not sort of in a disagreement perspective. And only 25% are saying, or I'm sorry, about 1/3 saying that they agree at all, and only a very small number saying that they strongly agree. So, and I should say within the disagrees, there's a large segment, 1/4 of the total respondents here, that said that they strongly disagree with the idea that this is actually making them better as a digital marketing team. So what this means is that personalization is hard. The things that we're finding in other research is telling us that the scenarios that organizations in other industries have used that drive very clear, very direct value just don't map up very well to the needs of healthcare websites. And so some of the things that they're doing in travel and finance and some of these other areas, the use cases that we have don't necessarily align very well with the way they're doing things there. And so, there's some real challenges finding the areas where this adds very clear value, and then being able to execute on that and doing those things successfully continues to be a challenge, and it's going to be a learning process for quite a while here. We actually broke that out and sort of crossed between the personalization methods that people were using and their ability to demonstrate. And so we sort of scored things out on that other question there and used this in that way. I will caution you on this data. I wanted to present it because I think it is somewhat enlightening. However, the ends around this are very, very small. And so, at the largest, we have, 14 or 17 people indicating they're personalizing around this thing. So it's hard to draw hard conclusions from this data at this point, but I think it's good to sort of see some of the illustration of this. And so, offline actions, the organizations that are doing that feel pretty good about it. As you can see, though, that's an N of 4. So we had, 3 3s and a 4. And you can see what a 3 or a 4 is. Someone strongly agree. There are areas like web browsers and personas that are getting pretty decent scores here. And then farther down the list were things like geographic-based personalization. That's turning out to be very, very hard for a lot of organizations to execute, and very little around user accounts that was really meaningful. And I apologize, this is rendering a little bit funny here in the PowerPoint, and so half of our labels are gone. But the complete chart again is in the publication. So if you want to dig more into that one, you can get that in the ebook. All right, so it's a lot of data, a lot of insights. I wanted to summarize a little bit of this though, and particularly look at it the lens, wherever you're at, what are the things that out of this data we would suggest you focus on in order to up your game. And so, particularly as you're, if you're going back after this and scoring yourself out and putting yourself in one of those 3 peer groups, what are the things that you should maybe be focusing on as you try to continue to improve and improve in the years to come? So for that group that's falling behind right now, we had a couple of recommendations here. First off is hiring smart. So the leaders have a lot more resources, that's true. But even when they have much larger teams, they are more aggressively outsourcing, reaching outside their organizations for expertise than the average and the laggards in particular. The laggards are in a position where they seem to be trying to execute a lot based on internal staff. And anecdotally, we're seeing that a lot, in many cases, that staff's being pulled from elsewhere in the organization, so they don't necessarily have a deep background in some of these areas. And they're spread so thinly across the different things they're being asked to do within digital that it's hard to get really good at any of those things. It is hard in this day and age to be the generic webmaster trying to do all things and still be able to keep up with how those areas are moving and do them all well. So, we see with the leaders, even with larger teams and the ability to focus more staffing in focused areas, they're still reaching outside the organization more often in order to get the deep expertise in design or SEO or PPC or any one of these different functional areas. The second thing for the organizations that are behind is when you want to step up your game, a great first step in that process is often the redesign. And we saw amongst the laggards, the largest number of organizations planning a redesign in the coming year. 71% of those organizations are planning a redesign right now. So they're not content to stay in that group. But you should also realize a redesign is not a silver bullet that fixes all your problems. It is a great way to kick off doing things better and getting your house in order so that you can be more effective with all the other things you need to do. But if you do a redesign and then you don't resource it effectively ongoing and you don't have the other initiatives and the campaigns and all the other things that doing digital effectively really requires, you're just going to find yourself back in that laggard category 2 or 3 years from now as you're looking at that next redesign as a way to sort of start to catch up again. The last thing is, this was just a group that we felt very strongly the lack of the MarTech stack, right? So, they have a CRM or a CMS for the most part, content management system. Very few of them have CRM solutions. They don't have a lot of the other tools of the marketing technology tech stack these days. And so look to start building out some of those tools as well. And again, self-reported, this was the group that felt like we are really hurting because we don't have the tools, and we're really hurting because we don't have the skills, the ability to train, and we're trying to do too many things in-house at the same time. And so they're kind of getting hit from left and right from those perspectives. And in those situations, it's really hard to catch up with organizations that have some of those things at their disposal. For that group that's keeping up and not excelling, couple of things we wanted to point to. And the first is thinking through how you're investing and how you're staffing things. As you're going forward, I think average organizations, the typical organizations, are doing a lot of things well. But if they were going to add additional capacity, before you go adding more capacity to execute, it's probably worth your while to add capacity to measure and deliver on the value. Be able to communicate the value that you're delivering to the organization. You need to get to the place where you're having a positive spiral. You do something, you can measure what you're doing, those results are good, you report those back out. Then when you go for resources to do the next thing or go bigger on something, you're armed with a much better case to do that. You're much more likely to get those additional resources, which then allow you to do more good things that you can then measure and so forth. And so that's an important piece of things. When you have skill gaps, again, the leaders are outsourcing more aggressively, even though they have larger teams. And so be very critical of the areas where you really need to have the expertise in-house, or an area where if you're only dedicating a small slice of an FTE to a particular task, look to see where you can go outside, find someone who's really an expert in that task, And I guarantee you, for the quarter of an FTE that you're putting into it, you'll get more out of it working with someone who's focused on that kind of thing all the time than you will with someone who's splitting their time between that and 3 or 4 other major areas. And finally, continue to push things forward. You know, push your strategy. It's an area that the leaders are doing particularly well. And continue to push the boundaries. It is one of the things that the leaders seem to be doing. When they're aggressive in that area, it helps them move the ball forward. And then finally, for the organizations that are ahead today, you know, realize that the problems that you're solving today are harder problems to solve. The easy stuff you've done, the only moderately hard stuff you've done, now you're really paving new roads out there, and that is harder work. So you're going to run into some of these issues where offline operations are a genuine barrier to executing on things you want in your digital user experience. So go out there and build relationships with those parts of the organization. So when you start to hit those things, that you know who to talk to, that you've already built some credibility with them, and they're more likely to be able to come and help you execute on the things your organization needs to do in order to move forward in these areas. Leaders are investing in strategy at a much more aggressive pace than everyone else. They're putting more FTEs into strategy than any other area. And so we're seeing that investment in forward thinking paying off. But don't let up, because again, there's a lot of organizations that are pursuing you. They're seeing what you're doing. They're attempting to copy it. They're attempting to catch up. You need to continue to move forward in order to stay ahead of the curve. And then finally, continue to work on connecting the dots. The leaders are much more effective at building the business case, at measuring their success. However, even at that level, I think it's 52 or 53% that are really feeling like they're able to do that effectively. We have a long way to go in order to be able to clearly communicate all the value we're delivering in terms of our digital efforts. And the better we can do at those things, the more effective we're going to be within our own organizations going forward. So with that, we have time for a few questions here.
Thanks, Ben. So we have a few in here on personalization. So Brian is asking if you feel marketers are using the term personalization to describe what was traditionally called segmentation.
So it's a good question. We didn't actually ask, like in an open-ended format, how do you define personalization? We were feeling out a little bit what people feel like they're talking about when they talk about personalization. And as I mentioned, we've done some other research exercises in the last year trying to understand this a little bit better. And so personalization in some ways is, they're looking at it from a wide range of different technologies. So when they say personalization, it's not just web. It's certainly email, it's certainly social, it's a number of other areas out there where they're looking at trying to more effectively put the right message in front of the right person. That said, that line that I think you're probing for there, where, you know, are we doing, you know, N of 1 marketing? And the answer is no. And very few organizations are even close to that. We are talking about still reaching out to folks within segments for different messages. I guess you can get to the idea that, well, you know, we have segments for this thing and segments for this thing, and you're a combination of those segments. So what you see may be very unique to you because you're the only one who might fit into that combination of segments out there. But, you know, at the end of the day, whether you're looking at personas or, you know, whatever approach you're using, it is to some degree segmentations. We're getting blocks of people, we're defining blocks of people and trying to put the right content and messaging in front of them. That said, though, that's a big step forward from the place where we've been, where everyone gets a, you know, very non-dynamic cookie cutter web presentation. And for a lot of organizations, that's where they've been. And so even things where the content is dynamic, where it's keeping itself updated, it's providing relevant you know, related information on an ongoing basis, things like that. That's a big step forward for a lot of organizations. Being able to then, you know, adapt the experience based on where you are geographically, or where you came from, or what you were searching for when you came here, or in some cases, past behavior, things like that. Those are a big step forward, even though, in the great scheme of things, I think you could very well define those as segmentation rather than personalization. We're all trying to move down that pathway.
Okay, gonna skip ahead. Had another question on personalization, but I wanted to get another good one in here. And we'll circle back to that personalization question later if we have time. But Win is asking, what's the question, topic, or trend that you think you'll include in the 2019 survey, but did not include this year for whatever reason? That's an interesting one.
So exactly what we include and don't include is an area of much debate every time we've done this. I don't honestly know. I've got a set of ideas of things that I kind of wish we'd included, and in some cases things that I wish we'd broken out or it asked in different ways. The reality is the survey is longer than we'd like it to be to begin with, but it's just so hard to say, oh, we shouldn't dig into this particular topic out there. So I'm not sure what areas we're specifically going to dig into there. I think we may look at areas like reputation monitoring, reputation management, listing management, some of the things that are falling into the laps of the digital marketing professional that are pretty significant components that frankly they're not necessarily getting new resources to be able to deal with out there. That's one of those ideas. I think maybe the thing we'd love to hear, and when you fill out the survey afterwards, is what are the things you wish we'd asked that we didn't ask this year? Getting a little bit more of that input from folks like you, I think, is probably more meaningful to us as we try and decide what's important for us to dig into, and what kinds of things might we explore next time than sort of the ideas that we have. So if you've got strong thoughts on that or ideas that you'd like for us to explore next time we go about doing this, I do encourage you to go and fill that out in the comments section. We'd love to hear that kind of information.